Hello and welcome everybody to the inaugural Atlantic Regional Solidarity Network online Charla de Profundidad. It's which was going to be a series of online informal in-depth discussions. And this first one is titled L. Jones, Abolitionist Intimacies, in which L. Jones will speak on how to live in a society based on care and compassion, not punishment. This charla is being presented by Atlantic Regional Solidarity Network in collaboration with the Madhu, Verma Migrant Justice Center, the Atlantic Abolition Coalition, the Coalition Against Prison Expansion, Cape, New Brunswick, and Cape Breton University's Global Social Justice Project. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm Catherine Hughes. I am joining you as a daughter of white South Africans transplanted to unceded Mi'kmaq, the unceded home of the Mi'kmaq Nation. This is where the Mi'kmaq Julassi, or welcome to settlers, was met in Kjipuktuk by a take attitude of the colonizers, and whose concept of Umsit Nogama, all my relations, which recognizes living beings, all living beings as relations, was met by an extractivist attitude and view of so-called natural resources. So because of this, this land has been subjected to devastating industry over the years, including such practices as clear cutting of the ancient old growth forest that stretched far and wide. The land has been witness to such horrors as Edward Cornwallis's 1749 genocidal proclamation and the carrying out of that proclamation against the Mi'kmaq people. Also, it has witnessed Le Grand Dérangement, the expulsion of the Acadians, and the existence of slavery in this land, and also an economy that was very much entwined with the transatlantic slave trade, the kidnapping and enslavement and dislocation of African people, and the Southern plantation slavery. This was followed later on, after Confederation of so-called Canada, by reservation apartheid, centralization, and the kidnapping and imprisonment of Mi'kmaq children in so-called residential schools. The economy that evolved after Confederation has been also an extractivist economy that has been propped up and enforced by a legal system and prison system that that has been very unjust, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Elle, especially because I think a lot of what she has to say about prisons and the way that the punishment-based society and justice system can help us to move out of this kind of a system in time. So I'd like to welcome Elle Jones. She's a community activist, a poet, and an educator living in African Nova Scotia. Elle is an incredible wordsmith, a powerful speaker, and the author of many articles and several books, the most recent being Abolitionist Intimacies, published by Fernwood Publishing. And as I said before, today Elle will speak to us about how to live in a society based on care and compassion, not punishment. Elle, thank you very much for joining us, and go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. I apologize, I'm very sick, so It is what it is. So I think since I wrote a whole book on this, what I'm going to do is read some stuff to you from my book, and then we can Q&A. So if you have questions, then you can just ask anything rather than me presenting something other. So if that, well, it doesn't matter if it works for you, that's what I'm doing. So that's how we're going to proceed. Hopefully that works. So this is from a chapter in my book called The Prison is Always With Us. I'm in Banff at the time. I was writing the first draft of my book, and this picks up in the middle of the essay. The works of prisoners are all around us. In my first week in Banff, submerged in pages filled with the voices of prisoners and deportees, I find out that Banff National Park was the site of an internment camp for enemy aliens during World War I. In the library, I find the book Park Prisoners by Bill Weiser about the prisoners who built Western Canada's national parks. I open the book at random to find the story of George Lukabudak, a Romanian internee who died by suicide on Christmas Eve, carving his stomach open with a razor and then slitting his throat. I read the passages with Jerry's voice layered over, telling me of loneliness at Christmas, of abandonment, of men going quietly to their cells and closing the door. These were not captured soldiers. The prisoners were mostly Ukrainian immigrants, conscripted to break rocks and dig roads and cut trails. They were marched in chains, at the point of bayonets, abused, starved, freezing. We bundle up for nature walks and hikes up the mountain. It is bitterly cold. Trying to picture what it would have felt like in a camp here is impossible. There is a masseuse on staff, and the artists get discounts. Some of the men were rounded up for losing their jobs due to growing wartime hysteria. Some refused to register. Some tried to cross the border to the United States. Reports at the time said the government was benevolent in their treatment toward the men. At the end of the war, many of those left in the camps were deported. For the rest, wages were withheld. There are all kinds of these camps in Canada, not just the Japanese internment camps in World War II, or the camps in Canada's national parks in World War I, but during the Depression also. Citadel Hill in Halifax, Todd McCallum tells me, was a camp for unhoused men in the 30s. Conscientious objectors, particularly Mennonites, were another group rounded up and forced to work during World War II. Over and over again, the same stories. Undesirables, foreigners, the displaced, all rounded up and incarcerated on the excuse of security or necessity or useful labor or cleaning up. We build prisons, tear them down, forget the stories, and build another prison. There was Abdul Abdi, and after Abdul there was Elmi, and the same thing happens over and over. And 100 years ago, only kilometers down the road, a prison camp for other immigrants. The same fears about borders and safety and foreign and danger. There is a building here named for the transatlantic pipeline, a tribute to the oil money in this place. And I think cynically that 100 years from now, that will be all there is, a landscape of prisons named for oil companies. It would be the least honest stance in the world to pretend these things dent our enjoyment. I might think about how Banff was built by prisoners while I'm eating my unlimited buffet in the Three Ravens restaurant, but that does not stop me from going back for dessert. I might recognize the incredible privilege I enjoy of writing here is because someone else died, or less starkly, because someone else is working serving food at minimum wage. But beyond having the thought, what else do we do about it? We comfort ourselves with the acknowledgement, oh, prisoners, that's so sad. And then we keep on about our day. The truth is, all our pleasures, all our works are founded on people's suffering, both past and present. And the truth is, we put it out of our minds constantly. Even those I love dearly, locked away, I have thought on their conviction I would not get over the sorrow, but we get over and move along. Sorrow is not something we can hold in front of us. It slips away constantly. There are times when my internal geography of Canada moves from prison to prison, when I move around the country with voices of prisoners in my ears, when landscape recalls drives out to remote prisons. Just because it never appears on the signs does not mean the prison is not with us. There is a monument at the foot of Castle Mountain now for the internees, a statue with the word "why" written on it. Perhaps one day all prisons, all border camps, all airports where people were deported from, all roads where vans with chained prisoners are transported. Perhaps all of those will one day be places people go to ask why, where they brush tears from their eyes, where they think of how brutal, how unfair things were in the past. But even if they were, I'm not naive enough to think there wouldn't be some new but same injustice, some other prison, some other safety, some other punishment. Hope, I say, and try to mean it. There's still hope. We'll find another way. Keep your head up. Be safe. Call me back soon. Talk later. It is 3 weeks until Christmas. So that was just an excerpt from that chapter. I'm just going to sort of flip around in this book. Let's see, I have all these markers in my copy and then I never know what they actually mean, like what they're supposed to be telling me to read. I'm going to read a bit about Abdul and Fatuma, but I can never find my way through in this book. So 1 second. All right, I'm just going to read this short section. This is from the section recollect fragments for Abdul and Fatuma. So this is about the deportation of Abdul, Abdi, and Fatuma, and it's a lot of my notes and diaries from court from when we were going through the case. But this is the very end part. July 17th, 2018. Ralph Goodale announces Abdul will not be deported. I get a call from Desmond. When I pick it up, Ben is on the line too. Ralph Goodale just tweeted the government will respect the court's ruling on July 13th, and Abdul will not be deported. We've been through too much, lived long enough to get too excited. I wonder if maybe someone hacked into Goodale's account, but who would hack into a minister's Twitter to talk about Abdul? Nobody has called Ben or Abdul to tell them the deportation is over. After all these months, his life is saved in a tweet put out at 9 p.m., right before a cabinet shuffle. All those court hearings, all the briefs filed, all the arguments, the news stories, the endless interviews, the questions to Trudeau, the emails written, the phone calls, the thousands of tweets, the money the government spent arguing against his rights, coming down to 2 sentences. The government of Canada respects the decision filed on July 13th by the Federal Court of Canada concerning Abdul Abdi. The government will not pursue deportation for Mr. Abdi. Sitting in Adil's apartment with Abdul months ago, he heard me give an interview about his case. When I got off the phone, he said with some wonder, "You're really taking this seriously." "I would burn this all down for you," I tell him, and I mean it. Before we started this, we asked each other, how far are we willing to go? Would we drain our bank accounts? Would we get on a plane? Would we lie down on the runway? And yes, we would do anything. We have to be willing, because our will and our love is the only thing standing between Abdul and the government, between Abdul and the abyss. Our love is what started this, what has held us. We would never have let him go gently. July 29th, 2018. Abdul comes to see me before a workshop I am giving with Black Lives Matter Toronto. I am standing on the street waiting for him. When he sees me, he grabs me into a hug, lifts me off my feet. He is free. I am crying. It is the most joy I have ever felt in my life. Okay. I'm going to read quite a lot from this next section. I usually only read the next part, but this time we're going to read it all. So, sorry, I haven't, once you put the book down, okay, here we go. So Sarah Tessier is one of the women I worked with in Nova Institution that I wrote with. She's now the director of the prison, what would I call it? She works for North Pine Foundation, and they fund projects that help people be reintegrated. So she's got out of prison and she's been giving back. She's also a victim of rape in the prison. A male guard was raping a number of women, and Sarah was one of the women that was raped and then had to testify against him. And when she did testify, it's not in the book because it happened after the book went to press, but she wished him forgiveness and well-being as well. So even in that moment, she maintained these abolitionist principles. But I'm going to read that section, and then the next section after that is about Randy Riley. Randy's story is traced throughout the book. He's a wrongfully convicted African Nova Scotian man that was convicted of the murder of a white man. He's still actually waiting for his trial. So at the time when I wrote this, I said he was coming to trial in October. This would have been in June 2021. He still hasn't come to trial yet. But that section is about Randy getting out when we've won his appeal at the Supreme Court. So I'm going to read both of those sections. And this is from an essay called Still Not Freedom. You deserve a cat, Sarah texts me. I love her kittens so much, and she wants to get me a cat to love and be loved by. Sarah has been out about 1.5 years. I met her in Nova Institution, where I got into trouble for hugging her after riding group. Or perhaps it was because I asked her about her life. Or perhaps because I told her to contact me when she got out. All these things, all these acts of kindness and humanity are not permitted. Sarah gives me my cat only months after she files a lawsuit against the guard who raped multiple women in the prison. The prison couldn't keep her safe. The prison doesn't even try to keep women safe. She had to investigate her own rapist, gather the evidence, subject herself to his harassing calls so they would be able to catch him. Such a brazen act of violence, out in the open, just another shift at work. Who would speak up? Who would listen? It is out of this horror that Sarah is bringing me life. She is not just gifting me a pet. She is remaking care. In a place where duty of care becomes assault, where touch is violation, where trust is exploitation, Sarah still believes love can be given in tangible ways. On the day the cat is ready to be taken home, Sarah comes with me to collect her. Driving home with the terrified cat struggling in my arms, I am conscious of this small, shaking, fragile life. This is what it feels like to have another being's life quite literally in your hands. Even now, I feel the ghost of her fur, her warm body, the terrifying sense of the power I have over her. Ew, you're an animal kidnapper, says my partner, a diehard hater of petdom. He's being facetious, but still, is this what it feels like to be a guard? To know that her food, her warmth, her being are directly under my control? I think of the terror of homecoming for this cat, being taken from her mother and brought to a place with no familiar nurture, no comforting other fur, with all the wrong smells. How fervently, how helplessly we believe home is safety, until it isn't. Until the punch, the nighttime trespass, the rejection, and after prison, how we believe homecoming is the end, how we forget prison still lingers in the running tap, the panic attack, the nightmare, how coming home is so often not what was promised, what was wished for, how often it sends people back. That night, the cat hides behind shoes, won't come out for food. She remembers that awful drive, but the next morning she eats, and in a couple of days she stops wandering the room looking for her mother. If only all dislocation were so easily absorbed and forgotten. I'm not there when Randy gets out. There's so much delay. First, after his appeal at the Supreme Court, the Crown tries to remove his lawyer from the case. So that delays bail for a couple of months while they fight the removal. Then, when we make it to the bail hearing, the Crown gives everyone a hard time, grilling us on the stand, calling his cousin's landlord to find out if she lives in public housing and if they're aware Randy is charged with murder. They claim she's violating the housing rules by offering for him to live with her. Randy feels like he'll be an imposition on his aunt, but it's obvious she wants him. Then there's the monitoring anklet, which has to be programmed from Colorado and transported from Toronto, and which costs $600 to install. And there's only one technician to install it, and that's 3 hours away from the jail. We hoped he'd be out for his birthday, but that comes and goes. We remake plans. Finally, a couple of weeks after the decision to release him on bail, the anklet arrives. It's late at night, and he can't leave without his sureties. So they drive to the jail 2 hours away to get him. On the way home, they stop at Burger King. Randy orders 2 bacon double cheeseburgers without the bacon. He's Muslim. Everybody laughs at this, Boy, you must have been in prison too long. When Randy calls to tell me he's out, at first, I don't recognize his voice. I become so used to how it sounds filtered through the prison phone. Voices sound crisper, clearer in freedom. But of course, this is still not freedom. I get to Randy's house in the historical Black community of Cherrybrook right when they're leaving to go visit his mother's grave. We drive toward the church, but Randy's family lives all along the road on the way. We have to keep stopping, going into homes, greeting elderly aunts and cousins. It's a slow procession, like the Stations of the Cross or a pilgrimage. Each stop, another blessing. Reconnecting with the land, with the generations of his ancestors upon it, reconstituting life, reforming, and remaking. Such an appropriate prelude to visiting the dead, to first honor the living. A reminder that we are still here, and we persist. Then the graveyard, anchor of history in the community, his mother's grave, never visited until now. A marker, not of death, but of generations in this place, from this place. Another blessing for people dislocated and dispersed, to be close to one's dead. I will never be buried beside my ancestors here in this far-flung country. Where my mother's bones go, I will follow. To walk upon this earth, in this community, and to draw near to the past, a ritual of completion. And after the graveyard, there is the kitchen, with family coming in and out. Men bring clothes, disclaiming the act of shopping for another man, but they went to the mall anyway. Since Randy has been gone, pants have gotten tighter. We laugh at his skepticism. Then there is pleasure at his appearance, clean, fresh, new, remade. The kitchen, place of life and nourishment, filling us with joy. And in the middle of the back and forth and the laughter and the jokes and the noise all overflowing, his cousin pauses. We made it out, he says. And again, we made it out. And I think, isn't that the Black condition summed up? And it feels poignant for a moment. But this is not the time for reflection. No, not now. Not surrounded by living, breathing, touching, speaking life. But of course, there is later. When Randy tells me how his ankle is rubbed raw by his anklet put on too tightly, and in the telling connects the wounds on his ankle with the enslaved ankles rubbed raw by shackles. He asks, is this 1821 or 2021? The blistering is made worse by the heat and the sun. Freedom for Randy is spending his days outdoors, cutting the brush on his property, carving out the land, building space for his daughters to camp and roast marshmallows. But this still isn't freedom. Not with an anklet, it isn't. And not with an October trial hanging over him. And not with 8 years lost to prison. And not with the crown still making him a monster. And not with the racism we can never make it out from. No matter where we go, how far we run, whatever escapes, we engineer for ourselves. I'm going to read one more section and then we can go to questions. These are just all the bits I like. I'm not choosing with any particular plan in mind. I'm just reading things I like. This is from my favorite essay in the book. It's called We Gonna Be All Right. So it was at a time when I was applying for jobs. I wasn't getting any jobs. I was broke. At one point I was like living in the car, like on the couch of people. There was bed bugs in my apartment. All these things were going on. So this is a time when I've just got rejected for another job. And it's about picking ourselves up and continuing the work. So this is not starting at the beginning. People talk about self-care, but what can that mean when the people who care most deeply for you and the ones who you love in return are the people to whom you owe your labor? It isn't a burden to do this work. Not when the trust and solidarity and profound love you build by your commitment to each other are the reward. But still, when the calls from segregation come in the evenings, it means there's no going to movies or out to dinner or even watching a whole show on Netflix. And that's the work that won't get a tenured job. That's the work that puts pain in your body and takes years off your life. But when M calls me and tells me I sound down, and I tell him I don't know if I'll have a job next year, he says, I get a welfare check every month. Let me send you that. Someone like you should never have to ask for help. Nobody else, not the heads of departments, not the colleagues and friends, nobody else has offered everything they have like that. This is why we answer the phone evening after evening. I think often about Rocky's portraits in the law school at Dalhousie. I knew Rocky, knew at the end of his life he was still having to scramble for cash. The institutions that spend tens of millions on buildings could have funded a chair for Rocky Jones. If they had wanted to, if they valued him, they could have done it. After all the years of fighting white supremacy until his heart literally gave out inside him, the institutions to which he gave so much could have made a place for him to live out his life in dignity. They chose not to. And the same universities that couldn't spend a few thousand to make sure Rocky was taken care of display his picture, now that he is safely dead. Desmond says to me, we may not be religious, but what we do is like a religious act. We imagine and work towards a better world, but the heaven we are trying to make is here on earth. And while we are living here and struggling, we are in hell. But heaven and hell are the same place for us. So every day we wake up in hell and we have to do our best to enter heaven. Every single day we have to try to knock on heaven's door. We have to sacrifice for that. And we have to pay the price for that. We don't hold anything back in this work. Not savings, not our tongues that get us labeled troublemakers, not even our tears, although we push them back and get up the next morning and keep fighting on. Because someone has to buy the groceries, put the clothes in the prison boxes, pay the gas for visits. Somebody has to hold the hands in court and call the lawyer and visit the jail and take the call from the suicide cell. Sometimes I lie in bed and think about the books I should have written, the papers I could have published, the poems and articles and chapters I didn't give my time to. And everyone tells me I wouldn't be lying here if I had just written those things. But then I ask myself, which life would I exchange for that book? Whose life is worth less than a chapter? And I know I wouldn't choose differently, just as nobody would choose differently. Not if you knew the life that was in front of you, that you had the power to sustain and hold. We are the living archive, I remind myself. And there is no tenured position, no degree, no qualification that can give me what is worth more than one life. It is not that I save them. It is that their trust and care sustains and nurtures me. That every day when I despair, when I don't know how I can pick up and rebuild again, when I don't know how I can fight these fights without sickening and dying from it, it is their voices that remind me over and over who I am and why we do this work. And these are my instructions to the people around me. If I die before you, make sure those who loved me and whom I loved are the people at my funeral. Scatter my ashes outside the prisons of this province so I can haunt them forever. Don't use my name for whack shit, and don't let the institutions that wouldn't love me in life take hold of me in death. If I die violently, remember that I hated prisons and honor me. I'm not imagining my death. These are my expressions of my commitment to the living, to my life and the life of others, to the sacrifice that isn't a sacrifice, but a sacrament, a blessing. Thank you, everybody. We have quite a bit of time for questions. So I just tried to make some choices. I said the talk was about love and care other than punishment. And that's really, I will say that the title of the book is based in the idea of what I call carceral intimacies. So the jail, the state uses intimate practices to abuse them. So the strip search, monitoring visits, searching our stuff when we go in, surveillance. These are all practices that get inside our intimate lives. Child welfare, obviously coming inside our homes, which are practices of what I call carceral intimacies. And as opposed to that is Abolitionist Intimacies, the title of my book, which is our acts of love and care and sacrifice that fight against the state. So that's the title of the book, and that's kind of the idea, and that's sort of opposing. So we oppose punishment with love. But I'll stop talking, and people can please feel free to ask questions. Or speak, or bring stuff up.
Can I speak? Hello?
Hello, go ahead. Yes.
My name is Sekou Diakite. Originally, I'm from Ghana, and I know a lot of people will know Ghana to be known as a Gold Coast due to the colonial issue that happened. And I know Catherine also touched on, she's from South Africa. So definitely she will know about the apartheid movement that went over in South Africa. And I like the way, El Jones, you touched on the historical context and all the way you talked about how slavery and also our current system is deep rooted, and it kind of maintains power and privilege, at the same time oppresses the voiceless. And I like the way you were looking at how various activists, such as somebody like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, how they risk their lives to advocate for people, whereas our society, currently not a lot of people can do that. Now, I'll quickly touch on what led me to the Madhu Verma Migrant Justice Center. I am a social work student at St. Thomas, and the main reason why I joined the group was to advocate for social justice and how people find themselves in precarious situations. As a former refugee myself and someone who has been in the detention center, I will testify that all the literature that you were sharing showed that there's a systematic review and a meta-analysis and a correlation between how people are being treated and how it affects their health. So you were talking about we should show love and care instead of punishment. Now, as part of my social action placement with Madhu Verma, we have found that the immigration detention system in our province here in New Brunswick, it is failing people, especially people from temporary foreign workers to migrant workers, international students, anybody in general that finds themselves in a precarious situation. Our system fails them. And also we've been looking at how various provinces like Alberta, Nova Scotia, and also British Columbia, they have been able to engage in a very ferocious advocacy with Amnesty International and other local organizations to call for a boycott of detaining immigrants in provincial jail. And that has been very successful. So we are looking at in society, we don't have individual problems, but we do have social problems. And lack of social determinants of health leads people into various vulnerabilities. For instance, we've seen these immigrants who are coming in from South and Latin America, all the way to seek better life, to support their families, to escape from violence. We know the only option that they have in our country, mostly through irregular border crossings, like Roxham Road. And we've seen how various political parties are using that platform as a political football to advocate on what favors them. Now, back to what I have been doing as part of my research is, why should we detain immigrants? Why should we make our system favorable and fair to everybody, so everybody, as enshrined in UN constitutional human rights, everyone should live freely and have the access to services that a lot of people have, whereas other people do not have. So we have been looking at engaging various advocacy groups to join our movement and see how we can allow the province of New Brunswick to cancel any contract agreement they have with the government of Canada, so that the provincial jails will not be used to detain immigrants. For instance, we know that there is a new jail that is being proposed in Fredericton. So it goes on to tell you that even though people went into the city hall people were advocating. You had experts like professional lawyers, academians, research experts who were saying that we don't need jails. We need a society where we will support the people who are being marginalized. And putting people in jail is only going to reinforce that notion that jail is a place where people go and they are rehabilitated. They come back into society and they can function. But we know that that is not true. People go to jail, they come back, they are worse off than they even went to jail, because the systems in jail are not meant to provide safe reintegration for people. People go into jail, like you were saying, they are shackles, they lose their dignity. People do not have access to legal services. So we are looking at how we can engage other advocacy groups to pressure the government and also our province to boycott putting in immigrants into detention facilities. We have done some work so far, but at the end of the day, I think united as together as we stand is a very important way that we can work with other organizations to support this program. So my first question to you is, what is your opinion, or what do you tell people that say that immigrants or people who come through irregular border crossing should be detained? That is my first question. And my second question also is, what are some of the advocacy strategies that you can share with us so that we can implement into our organization to continue to engage in the activism and make sure that we have voices to support people, at the same time promoting people's human rights?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for all of that. There was a lot of richness in that. You wove together so much important stuff. For those who aren't aware of the reference to the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International campaign, this was a campaign to end immigration detention in provincial jails. So every province has a deal with CBSA, Canadian Border Services, where like they allow their jails to be used for immigration detention. So BC was the first to cancel that. Nova Scotia has now committed to cancel that, Alberta. And so the other provinces are working on that as well. So that's certainly a campaign that people can join. It's through Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. It's called the Welcome to Canada campaign. And but it's a limited campaign in that it's for administrative detention. So in other words, people who are not accused of any crime, who are simply incarcerated for moving their body from one place to another. So if, for example, you don't have papers, they don't think they can trace your ID, they think you're a flight risk, stuff like that, you can be incarcerated. And of course, as I said, that takes place in provincial jail. There's not some special like immigration place. So the campaign is to force provinces into ending that agreement. Now, the danger of that, of course, is that CBSA then simply builds private immigration facilities. We know that those exist in the States. ICE, of course, runs a number of horrendous facilities. And some of the stories we got out of that were the sterilization of women in ICE facilities, the separation of children from their parents, the incarceration of children, which also happens in Canada. There's over 118 children in immigration detention in Canada. But even things like even worse than normal prison, like exploitative phone rates and stuff. So one of the things we have to be wary of in that campaign, the two things we have to be wary of is one, that in canceling the contract to provincial jail, we don't just end up with a contract on private immigration detention, which will lack government oversight, even to the tiny non-amount that the government does oversee. Of course, if you end up in a private situation, they're not accountable to anybody. And as we know from the States, when you build private prisons in any capacity, we find the people to fill them, right? Because they're on a kind of contract. So we would see much higher rates. So you have to be mindful of that. And the second thing we need to be mindful of is not using language such as, oh, these people are innocent and they're incarcerated with criminals. We have to be really careful about that kind of language. So when we say they don't deserve to be in provincial jail, we can't default into language that suggests that other people do deserve to be in these kind of facilities having their rights violated. So I just say that as some background for that campaign. But the question was, how do we, what is my response to people who say that irregular border crossers should not be accepted or should be detained? Well, the first thing is that Canada is a signatory to the UN conventions, and that includes accepting refugees. So we have to push back on the idea that there's something illegal about people crossing so-called irregularly. There's nothing illegal about that. People have the right to claim asylum, and there is a process in place to vet. Not that I agree with that process, by the way, but I'm saying, like, if we're talking legally, there is a process in place to vet refugee claims, right? Like, you go through a hearing. And so if people are following that, there's nothing that's happening here. So we really have to push back on the idea of illegals or illegal immigrants. There is nothing illegal about claiming asylum. And so that kind of rhetoric, which is being deliberately used to criminalize people, is deliberately used to create this connection in people's minds between committing a crime and moving. So not that meeting people with facts ever made a difference when people are arguing with you in bad faith, but the reality is that's not illegal. There's nothing irregular about crossing. And in fact, a former Minister of Immigration and Citizenship, Ahmed Hussein himself, claimed refugee status and fled into Canada, right? Like, he's the guy that was minister while we were fighting Abdul, and that was one of our points, that, like, you claimed asylum and now you want to send Abdul back. But like, literally a cabinet minister claimed asylum. There is nothing illegal or wrong with claiming asylum, and in fact we are obligated to do so under international laws and everything that we've signed on to. So that's, I suppose, my first answer. How do we organize? There's one of the more difficult organizing is migrant organizing, because especially, I only know in Nova Scotia, but I'm sure it's similar everywhere. Like, the farms basically act as detention facilities themselves. They don't let the people who are working have a lot of contact. They deliver, so like they have control of your papers. They can, if they say that you committed any kind of infraction, they can deport you the next day. The employee has full control over you. So of course, anyone who tries to organize, anyone who complains, anybody who pushed back, there's no hearing, there's no court process, like, they just kick you out of the country. So it really is a form of slavery. So people really aren't, not only are they, of course, like, heavily deterred from organizing, they go to great lengths to prevent those in the community from meeting with those who are working on the farms. So in Truro, for example, the Black community fought really hard to have the migrant workers who were Jamaican come to the church, like the Black church. And then when they brought them, they had guards in between them in the pews so that, like, the people in the community could not sit close to the migrant workers. So one of the most difficult things is getting involved in organizing of migrant workers. We've seen a lot of strides in that due to people's doing really strong organizing. So people began with stuff like trying to just do suppers or hold soccer games or whatever you can do in order to hear these stories and get closer. And that's, in recent years, there's been more organizing. Stacey Gomez from No One Is Illegal has done really great work in organizing there. And I mentioned that because what we most need in terms of immigration is these broad coalitions of international students, migrant workers, those of us who are immigrants or refugees. People forget, I'm an immigrant, I was 7, so particularly those, especially who are the so-called respectable immigrants, economic immigrants. I think people need to lend their voices. One of the things that was actually interesting about Abdul that I thought was quite unprecedented when we were fighting that deportation is usually it's hard to get people to fight for someone who's being criminalized, because a lot of people are very attached to, like, the model minority model or the respectable immigrant model. And in fact, a lot of organizations did come out and support him. People understood that it was wrong, mostly because of his youth, like, because he was a child in child welfare. But that, I thought, was a step forward, that people were less scared of being labeled like you support a criminal, because a lot of people who are immigrants fear for themselves and their communities, right? Our communities are always being labeled in particular ways. So people are often scared to wade into fights, like against the police or against the state, because they feel like we're already on a knife's edge. And then if you're labeled this radical community, we know what happens to, like, Muslim people who get infiltrated by agents, who get policed, and people want to protect their communities. So they often don't want to come out and, like, stand up on these so-called radical issues. So I think it's also important to find ways to get those kind of more mainstream organizations advocating and build that solidarity. But international students, I think, are an important resource. Youth are always good on the front lines. They'll always speak up, and they experience all kinds of exploitation as well. Obviously, we have to be careful because they can face deportation as well. So we don't put people into danger, but in terms of international students being willing to speak, they will come out, except we, like, as I said, like, not to endanger them. And then I think all of those communities in solidarity, because we can only push back. And I think in order to do that, we have to fight against these kind of binaries, like the respectable immigrants versus the bad refugees, the good economic migrants who came who are educated and not like that versus the dirty hordes, the ones that, the lighter skin ones versus the black refugees. Because so like there's all these binaries that are put in place, like those who are innocent, those who have been here for a longer term, those, so we actually need to get rid of those binaries and understand that everybody is precarious and therefore we all are in this fight together. So I think really fighting through that notion of respectability politics and of these kind of divisions that are put in place and that we buy into in order to protect ourselves. The most important thing we can do is work across that, because obviously the more people there are and the more power and the more mainstream groups, the more we protect those that are more vulnerable than ourselves. So building coalitions, that's going to be my answer to everything, I guess. But yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry about my voice, as you can tell, I'm quite sick. So, is there another question or just comments or just, I didn't like sit here and explain abolition.
Yeah, can I speak?
Go ahead. Yes, please.
My name is Albert Marshall, and I am from the Moose Clan. I am from Mi'kmaq, but I do live here in a community called Eskizoni.
Mm-hmm.
What I am wondering is that, did Martin Luther King die killed in vain? Because he did trigger something in the marginalized, especially to the Aboriginal people in the United States and in Canada. But somehow I feel that has somehow, I know why it's slow. I know why it's slowed down because of the police forces. But I think there's something that needs to be done from here on in of resurrecting or picking up the energy that Martin Luther King has brought forth to us. And that is, you can protest in peace. You can express your opinions and still be able to do it in freedom. Because I believe there has been too much silences. Because when we talk about genocides, we're not talking about something in the past. It's in the present moment. Especially when I look at the prison populations. Mm-hmm. Majority of the prison populations are Black and Aboriginals. Mm-hmm. And we know why, because as an Aboriginal person, any offense I do commit, I'm guilty until proven innocent. And if I do not have the fiscal resources to prove that I'm innocent, you know where I'm going. Mm-hmm. So have you ever heard of 2IC?
Yes, but please do explain it.
Well, anyway, central to the 2IC is the notion that the knowledge holder will be transformed. And that the knowledge holder is responsible to act on that knowledge. And basically, we look at things like decolonization. Decolonization to me is a process of reclaiming the past to heal while building a better future. But each and every time there is an attempt from us, we get blocked, either in court systems or by the other agencies like DFO or CMP. So the only hopes I have is that I hope someday all the people that have been marginalized conceive fit to see how we can embrace the spirit of collaboration and embrace the spirit of co-learning, and take upon that cause that we are no longer going to take that, and we have to use every means we have other than a sword, not just to be heard, but to make sure that the past will be somehow reconciled. Because if we don't reconcile the past, how can we expect people to heal and to excel in anything? So these are my points, and the only hopes I see is love and compassion will prevail. And I think this is what I believe what grounded Martin Luther King. But unfortunately, he was eliminated. But I'm also believing that I'm hoping he didn't die in vain.
Thank you, Elder. And yes, I mean, I didn't thank you also for raising, obviously, the issue. So nearly 50% now of incarcerated women federally are Indigenous women, and 1/3 of federal prisoners are now Indigenous people. Obviously, Indigenous people aren't on some like crime wave. Like this is the afterlife, the new residential school, right? So it's just a continuation of genocide and colonization. In terms of Martin Luther King, as we know, was shot when he was organizing poor people, sanitation workers in Memphis. So when he was connecting the struggle of race to the struggle of class was particularly when he was shot. Fred Hampton was eliminated when he built the Rainbow Coalition. So every time when we start crossing into organizing literally everybody, so when you are able to do that, that's exactly when you become the biggest threat to the state, which says exactly what direction our organizing therefore needs to go in, which is again, building across these solidarities. And in particular, as we know, if we don't organize like the working classes, then right-wing populists will use, this kind of rhetoric in order to present some kind of faux vision of prosperity. And we see that all over the place. I mean, Trump, Polyev, right? So the question is, what are we doing to listen to these needs and to like hear people and to organize on the ground as well? I guess very quickly too, I'll say the problem that we have, like I would say in the Black community, which is true of all communities. I mean, it's not unique to Black people. It's unique to any body facing a radical movement, is they always install gatekeeping organizations in order to suppress us and shut us down. So one of the problems we have with organizing is every time we actually get on the move and start being successful, the government will deliberately appoint gatekeepers, like elitist gatekeepers, in order to like soften our struggle. So like there's a reason why there's like 1 million Black organizations that are funded by the government that have popped up post George Floyd, and it's to take out the grassroots energy. And then we're supposed to settle for a bunch of business loans and like entrepreneurship programs, when in fact what we were supposed to be fighting for is against the police and against state violence. That's what George Floyd was. It was a mass uprising. He was murdered for passing a bad $20 bill, allegedly, right? So this is a fight against property, against the banks, against class warfare, and against obviously like the state violence. And somehow that got turned into, we need more people in corporate boardrooms. So we can't lose sight of this struggle, because the government always has its eye on how to suppress us, right? And I'm sure that's true, like the feminist struggle, same thing. There's always people that are willing to bargain and deal our communities or settle for less or get a few positions. And our liberation, which is abolition, and the abolitionist movement is about, it's not, I mean, prisons and punishment are one piece of it, but more broadly, it's an anti-capitalist struggle. It's land back, it's an environmental struggle, it's a struggle against, because prisons and police are the outcropping of a capitalist property-based society, right? The police are there to protect white property. So there is no abolition without understanding how capitalism has losers and winners. Those of us who are not part of the so-called public, Black people, Indigenous people, people who use drugs, people struggling with mental health, sex workers, trans and queer people, like et cetera, like immigrants, we're all the outside of that thin blue line, and therefore we can be policed, right? So that's the notion of punishment, is for those who do not fit into the conforming mold of citizen and worker, are therefore going to be removed either through deportation, through prison, through mental health, through placing you at the bottom of the ladder, through social services. And so our task is obviously to organize together. So thank you, Elder, for reminding us of that need, and particularly the need for building solidarities. And of course, there is no struggle for justice and no abolitionist struggle that doesn't begin in recognizing treaty, the sovereign territories, and recognizing the lands that we live on, and the ways of dealing with these things that pre-existed prisons, right? That there is a justice that already existed on these lands. There is already a model for care. There's a model for accountability. There's a model for restoration and transformation in communities that were here for hundreds of thousands of years, tens of thousands of years before contact and before any of us got here. And thank you, Elder, for reminding us of that.
But I also have to say that, I mean, I think we're in a very opportune time now, because you see, years ago, we would be out there alone. But today, luckily and gladly, whenever we come together on a common objective, injustices, whether it's human or environment, we do have now a lot of our brothers and sisters from the white race. So I think the opportunities are here before us now. And I'm still struggling. How can we optimize that opportunity of transforming change? Because the change has to be changed. Because I mean, right now, well, I don't use the word white. I use the only white I use is when I refer to the government and to the industry and to all the social programs, because these are the people that are fostering these injustices. So I think, you know, our terminologies, I think, you know, has to somehow be very specific. We're not painting everyone with one brush like the institutions have paint us with one brush. If one Indian or one black is done, you know, done wrong, everyone is bad. So I like to acknowledge and thank all the other brothers and sisters that are now very loving and compassionate for the injustices.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Yes, I have a question for you, Al. Hi, everyone. My name is Vince Zelazny, and I'm living in Wolastoqey territory here in Fredericton. And I'm also involved in the group, one of the sponsoring groups of this talk. It's the Coalition Against Prison Expansion in New Brunswick. And so some of you are familiar with what it is that we're trying to do. But before I talk about that, I just want to reflect for a moment on reading in your book, Al. And I think it's a profoundly moving and insightful presentation. I found a copy of your book finally last week in the library, and I know I can just kind of order it in, but I was trying to save a couple of dollars, and luckily for me, it was at the library. And so I've been drinking it down like a thirsty person in the desert, because it's just wonderful. And if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then you have painted numerous 250-word stories, pictures. And this in part explains why Abolitionist Intimacies is such a rich book, because it's much more than the sum of its parts. It's takes the reader beyond themselves and their own experiences into new territory, and helps us to empathize with other people and their experiences. I think it's just wonderful. And reading it has brought back memories of a dear friend of mine, and some of the people here I know remember Dr. John McIntyre, and I wanted to, it got me thinking about this, got me digging into some of my archives. So I have a photograph, and not many are shared or in circulation, that have John in them, and I'd just like to share that. Tracy, I don't know. Okay. Okay. Share. There it is. Okay. Yeah. So this is a picture of taken some time ago. You can see the color of my hair in this picture. This was probably in the 1990s. So that's John McIntyre on the left. He was a professor of sociology at St. Thomas University. That's me on the right. On my right is Michael Miller, who taught music for many years at Mount Allison University. And to his right is our friend Joe, who was an inmate and also a facilitator in the Alternatives to Violence project, which is something that John initiated in starting in 1995. And we have another Alternatives to Violence facilitator, at least one here, and that's Sarah Chandler, who's off in Lillooet. So anyway, this is something, this is a project where the model is to train the trainer, and the person can become a facilitator by attending 3 workshops on 3 weekends, a basic, advanced, and a training for facilitators 1. And it continues to happen at Dorchester. It's now led by Linda Foy of Sackville and Sharon McDonald of Halifax. These are both Atlantic region Quakers, and that's what we are. I'm a Quaker as well. We're finding that since the early days, it's becoming increasingly hard to book times to get into the prison and to bring outside participants inside. Diversity adds interest to AVP workshops. And of course, when you bring, for example, university students into a workshop like that, it really heightens the interest for the people inside, people of different ages. And, you know, it makes, when you lack that, the workshops are less dynamic than they could be. The staff reaction to our presence at Dorchester has been mixed. Some like it, others don't. A guard once shared that our workshops help inmates improve their social interactions and make the prison more peaceful. On another occasion, a guard shouted at us through the chapel's open door, and we hold these workshops in the chapel there. And he's saying that if it wasn't for them, we outside people could all be killed. Inmates, however, love our workshops. We know this by the anonymous evaluation messages they share at the workshop's end. So they really do like it. And since that picture was taken, cameras have been banned. We used to be able to take pictures of ourselves, we can't anymore. At mealtimes, we used to line up in the cafeteria line with both participants and the general inmate population, and where we would sometimes have conversations with non-participants curious about what we were doing. In the past, we brought undergrad students, as I mentioned. Security procedures for getting into the prison have been amped up continuously over the years. As a capstone insult to the gentle people who would be open to being intimate, abolitionist intimacy, engaging in abolitionist intimacy with the inmates, the CSE now requires that we be fingerprinted and that those be taken away and filed. So this is something you wrote, Elle. It's like this system is a monster. And even if you can see how wrong it is, you're not allowed to get out of its jaws. You're just supposed to get eaten and then do something about it later. It's the inhumanity of it that gets me. How the process itself seems to have more value than any human being caught up in its belly. We have to proceed because these are proceedings, so they have to go on. So anyway, this is, I know some of you know John, and anyway, it's great to be, John was mentioned in an email I got the other day, I think from Teresa. And so it's just great to be with you and to bring back all that memory that we have, that we share, and you're reminding us about what is possible. So now to the present, and Sekou, I thank you for your sharing earlier. And on the 29th of this month, we're having a meeting. Our group is having a meeting with the Deputy Minister of Public Safety and Justice. And if you care to join us, you could come to that meeting and you could ask him about immigration detention. And this was something I had intended to ask, but I think you're very schooled on this and would ask a better question than I could. So I put that invitation to you. Tracy can put you in touch with me.
Thank you.
And so Elle, finally, how do we bridge that experience? How do we make it real to people who hold the levers of power? How does it become real, or can it become real?
I mean, I'm probably the worst person to ask, because it's not like the government. I mean, in fact, they remove me on purpose from everything. So I'm not sure I've had much success. I mean, generally what happens is I feel like we sacrifice, put our lives on the line, and then the more liberal organizations pick up on some small thing, and then you just move incrementally like into some kind of reform. In terms of, say, fighting the prison expansion, I think we have to look at the sort of narratives that are used. So they're now using, for example, mental health or disability as a reason to, we make it, people are getting sick, and like Newfoundland uses, right? Like all these people died by suicide in the Newfoundland jail. So building a new jail is like saving people from suicide, right? Or they'll be like, oh, we made all these cells that like are wheelchair accessible, or like every cell has Braille outside. In other words, I think it's important to get disability groups on board, talking about how like jail is not an appropriate place to deal with like mental health and disability. So that's another important coalition piece, because if you notice, like the rhetoric is now shifting to like, we want to build these kinder, nicer jails, and like, do you hate mental health if you don't want people in this jail? But of course they have more beds, and we know statistically that if you build it, you will fill it. That's what happened with the women's prisons, right? When we moved from Kingston Prison for Women, the one federal prison, there was never more than 40 federally incarcerated women. When we built the regional prisons, we're now up to 500 federally incarcerated women. So did women suddenly get more criminal, or did we build more prisons and then find women to fill them, right? And that's the same thing that happens with every expansion. So we really have to fight that rhetoric around like, this is a kinder form of incarceration, or that like we need cells so people with wheelchairs or something. Like people with wheelchairs shouldn't be in the jail in the first place. So I think some of it is countering the rhetoric, but the difficulty is that, you know, the public, I mean, I just saw a survey that like a majority of Canadians support the death penalty for murder. So I mean, like, what do you, to a certain extent, like, how do you reach that group of people? And I don't know. I mean, you just chip away at it, like mental health. A lot of people have some kind of person in their family who's experienced mental health. People often have some family member somewhere that was incarcerated, or some loved one due to mental health or addiction issues. So I think speaking about that can be important. So like trying to get people to see it closer to home. Like when Patty Hadju was health minister, like she had addiction in her family, so she was open to decrim, right? So you know, like unfortunately people often only see things when there's a personal empathy. So I think bringing out, obviously we talk rightly so about like Black and Indigenous incarceration, but incarceration actually does touch a lot of like white middle class families too, because you have some family member that struggled with addiction or mental health and ended up incarcerated. But because those families are like ashamed of that and the stigma, they often don't reveal it. So destigmatizing, speaking about it can help people then understand how like this isn't just those bad people over there. Like it actually is something that is quite common and happens in a lot of families, and therefore, you know, we all have a kind of stake in resisting it. But yeah, I mean, government, no, I mean, it's, you know, that's why you have to chip away at things like solitary confinement and, you know, like stuff that you can get legally and procedurally, you know, like it's always kind of step by step there. Like, so it was years and years of the fight against SEG before they finally won the lawsuit. It's not that SEG has ended. They've just renamed it structural intervention now, and behavior units, and like unit B, and they have SEG and it's actually worse. But you know, like a combination of like the right cases, bringing them to court, you know, like trying to get them on places like where they can do reviews, getting lots of groups involved. But I don't know, I mean, it's like I kind of said this, like we have to get up every day and die for the world we're not going to see, right? That like it's hard because, you know, I've been screaming about this stuff for like 15 years, and I don't know that much has, like how much more further have we moved, but we just have to keep speaking about it and keep trying to bring people in, and then resisting, I think, a lot of the narratives. So what can we do with this money rather than building the prison? You know, this is how much housing that can be built. Did you know the majority of people that are incarcerated in a provincial jail are actually there on remand? It's between like 2/3 now and 80%. So these are all innocent people. We were able to release 41% of people into our community during COVID, and there was like no crime wave spike. So do all these people need to be incarcerated? So it used to be like a bad thing if 1/3 of the prison was on remand, and now it's 2/3 at minimum and up to 80% at sometimes. So like really talking about bail access. And that's also the Crown's office. So like, you know, I would also be talking to the Crown about like why they oppose bail. Obviously Indigenous groups are doing a lot of work on like community placement, and like there's a lot of, you know, like because Indigenous groups are using what we're supposed to be paying attention to for Indigenous people around like not incarcerating people. And that actually benefits everybody, right? That when you are able for an Indigenous person to say, well, maybe they shouldn't go to jail, let's give them community, then that exists as a precedent for other people. So supporting Indigenous groups in those kind of cases and fights, because that will benefit everybody. But the problem is there's a fairy tale about prisons. Bad people are in prisons, the cops keep us safe, the cops spend all their time solving murders and rapes. 50% of our media is crime-based. Like, we watch fictional crime shows all the time. We're fed from birth a myth about the police and prisons and bad people. And it's very, very hard because that is now sold to us as common sense. When we did the defunding report, right? What cops actually do in a week is like bylaw stuff, but people are convinced that the cops are constantly solving murders. And because we have this really powerful mythology, and it's like, oh, it's common sense. Like, you guys are so silly and radical to think we can do without the cops, so that we can do without prison. You really have to fight through that mythology. And that's difficult because people see it as a received wisdom, right? Like, oh, well, yeah, obviously we need prisons. Obviously bad people in prisons. Don't do the crime if you don't want to do the time, So I don't have a good answer, because obviously if I did, I'd have done it, but I suppose just keeping witnessing, like speaking out about things, like encouraging other people to speak out, and like getting other groups to see why there's, why it matters. Like, environmental groups should care about prison. The cops are an environmental disaster. Like, policing itself is an environmental disaster. Prisons are built in small towns. They're often built when industry has disappeared due to environmental destruction, like the loss of fishing or the loss of logging, and then there's nothing else in your community, so you therefore build a prison. So I think understanding prisons and policing as environmental issues and bringing environmentalists into this, which is a huge movement, and getting them on side, like, so prison expansion is an environmental issue, so where are the environmental groups fighting against that? That's what Cop City is, right? Like, fighting. So it was the anti-police people, but also the people that are defending the forest and being like, no, you shouldn't be. So for those who don't know what I'm talking about, Atlanta, they're building Cop City, which is a place for urban warfare, like training for the police, like war games. But they're obviously going to use against protesters, read Black people, and they're destroying a huge stand of forest in order to like put in this like urban warfare thing. And so people have been resisting that, and the cops have labeled them terrorists and charged dozens of people under post 9/11 acts. So we have the combination of the military, right, using 9/11 and terrorism. We have the combination of obviously the police, like anti-police movements, environmentalists, like it shows how everything's connected. And that's what this fight is. Like, prison is a disability issue. It's an environmental issue. It's obviously an Indigenous and Black issue. It's an issue for immigrants. It's an issue for people experiencing mental health. Like, so there's no reason why all of these groups can't be speaking back. And politicians respond when they think there's something in it for them, right? Like, tough on crime plays well with the voters, so they're going to be tough on crime until there's another alternative. So it's our job to raise those alternatives. This is a really long answer. I'm going to stop talking. There's also a comment I just wanted to raise. There was a comment in the chat about El Salvador, and yes, how like rounding up people. So in this so-called gang crackdown, 60,000 people have been placed into prison, which is just a indiscriminate kind of crackdown. And so globally as well, like recognizing the global ties to selling. So like prison is also used as a tool across the world as well. And particularly Indigenous people across the world are also facing prison. So I just wanted to highlight that comment from the chat as well. Sorry about, I'm getting like, you can hear my voice is getting real trash. Is there anyone else or anything else?
I have a question. When are we going to start reforming the system? Because it's a system that is fostering all these atrocities. We can do everything in our power to help our people heal, but if the system is not changed, I mean, it's a no-brainer. But I think there's enough people now that are deeply concerned that I think at least we should begin this discussion. How to reform the system, education, social, and injustice, because they're using those instruments of practicing the injustices to the minorities.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not one myself for like running for office and stuff, but I mean, those that are, I suppose we need to cultivate at least try and get some people in there that, you know, and we see what happens. I mean, Sarah Jama in Hamilton, who just won in the last 3 days, they tried to sway the race by, you know, calling her an anti-Semite because she's pro-Palestine, you know, and you see the usual smears that are made upon a progressive politician. So that's one of the things that is done to discourage people who have a history of progressive politics from running. So when people are running, then we need to like defend those people and stand up for them and resist, you know, the way that people will be. So, I mean, that's one thing. I'm not big on party politics myself, but since there's going to be people in power, if there are people running that, you know, will listen to these things, and we certainly need to cultivate that and support those people and make it viable for them to run as well. But I don't know. I mean, I never think these things really happen in the system. I'm not a huge in the system. Like my experience, particularly of say like the federal liberal government, is I've never met a more fragile group of people that, you know, expect you to be grateful to them. And if you don't, I mean, this is why I get kicked off of all kinds of stuff. They, you know, like I didn't praise David Lametti enough when we were like in a meeting. He asked for commentary on the justice system and I told him, and then he got upset and fragile about it. So, I mean, I don't know what you do with that if you don't even want to hear the truth. So I'm not a big believer in that myself, but whatever we're getting right now is because we hit the streets in 2020. That's, to me, is the answer. Like when we have enough people, when we hit the streets in some numbers, then people get scared and they give us something, like not what we want, but some kind of move. Martin Luther King knew that, right? That's part of what Malcolm and Martin's relationship was, that Malcolm knew that like, they'll be scared of me, so they'll deal with you. So, you know, part of what we do is push really hard, and then it becomes untenable to say nothing. So you get something, but then we keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing. So I think it's always our job just to organize on the ground and get more and more people. But will people in power listen? I don't know. I mean, like we're fighting corporate interests. We're fighting money. We're fighting like this common sense of the common man. We're fighting what Desmond Cole calls the angry white majority, you know, like, and that's a big ask. But all we can do is really start shifting things, at least forcing people to account for, at least forcing them to show another point of view, you know, at least challenging. And like TikTok exists, you know, like young people are out there. There's like, you know, you can do stuff where people will watch these things. So like using social media, using alternate channels, building our own media up, getting message to people in different ways, you know, making sure that younger people that, you know, are open to this are learning about this and thinking differently, you know. So I think we have a lot of opportunities for education. It's just, it's slow, and we have to recognize that. Like, it's not going to be in our lifetimes, right? But then when we think where we are now versus even 10 years ago, no one was talking, very, there was like 10 abolitionists in Canada, you know, 50 maybe. And now there's like lots of people that are interested in it. Defunding the police was extremely fringe, and now it's like common, like in that everyone knows what it is. So I think that's what we keep doing. We just have to keep standing firm in our ideas, not backing down, not accepting that these are radical or infantile or ridiculous things to believe. And every campaign, even when we lose on something, like you're not going to win on the prison, but you brought it up and you raised it and it's there and it has to be accounted for. And then some more people learn about it. And then next time and next time and next time, right? So we have to like play that long game, I think. And we can't lose faith that just because we didn't get the one thing now, we know we're not getting it, but we're learning how to organize through it. We're building a coalition. We're learning stuff for the next time, and we're putting it on the table. So at least then people have to respond in a different way, and it makes, you know, it forces them to respond to us as well. And I think that's, you know, we have to accept those kind of victories. And then sometimes we do get big victories, like we have won stuff. So I think neoliberalism that wants us to believe that there's no way out, that there's nothing that we can do, that they're always in control, that they always win, and therefore to discourage us. So that we think, well, I'm not going to bother running, I'm just going to get smeared. Well, I'm not going to bother saying anything, we can't win. And that's when they win. So we always have to move forward in that spirit of belief that we can win. And even if we're not winning today, we can win tomorrow. And every step we take today is an important step towards tomorrow. I'll also say, by the way, but I don't know if you got to this part of my book, but I do quote McKendy in my book, in page 120, I believe. So I talk about an essay of his that I really enjoy. Sorry, I feel like I'm just rambling in these answers. But I guess my same answer for everything is you're not going to win it today, but you have to keep fighting and bring more people in. That's all we can do. You know, like organize with people inside, like prisoners are abolitionists, organize with their families. There's a big coalition of mothers whose kids were killed by the police that, you know, is really gaining ground across the country and that have been fighting together. And that's powerful. There's families of people who have died in prison that are organizing. So just building those coalitions, working together, not believing that we're some kind of fringe minority. These are actually, this is sound public policy. What is unsound and radical is to believe that by spending billions of dollars a year on caging people, that brings us safety. It doesn't. It doesn't reduce crime. It doesn't create healing. It doesn't help victims. It doesn't stop sexual assault. It doesn't end domestic violence. It doesn't keep our community safe. It does none of those things. And it's actually radical to continue believing that if we just pour more money into this thing that doesn't work, that somehow it will work this time. That is radical. Common sense is saying if we fund preventative programs like housing, jobs, treatment, healthcare, that, then we will see our communities being safer. That isn't weird, and we have to stop conceding the idea that that's some kind of ponies and fairy dust. It's ponies and fairy dust to like believe in a conservative, tough on crime policy. That doesn't work. So I refuse to concede the ground that there's something we need to be ashamed of or some smear we need to accept about us. We have to just be like out and proud about what we believe and not back down and like put our case forward and continue working with each other and love each other and love the people we're working with, and step by step. That's all we can do.
Thank you so much, Elle. Everything you said is so inspiring and puts a fire under me to do more of what I do and push harder. And I hope it does for everybody else. I realize we've gone way over the time we suggested, and I know that you're sick and I don't want to push you anymore. But I do want to say that I posted in the chat farther up that today is a day of action, Migrant Rights Network Day of Action for Status for All. And anyone who wants to stay on after we wind this down as a charla, we could participate in it. It's just a matter of making a little sign, or if you have a printer at home, there's a place where you can print their sign, but you can make your own little sign saying Status for All, take a picture of you holding it, and Tracy has one there. Or we can do what Tracy's doing, just put them into the on our, hold them up to our cameras here. And also you can print a poster and stick it up in your community today or tomorrow or sometime in the near future. So anyone who wants to participate in that, stay on a little longer. I see a lot of people are having to leave, and thank you very much to all of you for having attended. There might be something else I wanted to, there's so many good suggestions for ways to think about activism that I certainly want to listen to this over again. But I guess I have one little tiny thing to say as a closing, and then the discussion can go on a little more if there's that interest, but I want to let Elle go because I don't want to make you sicker. But when I was a child, an adult friend of our family and kind of community taught us children a silly version of "Oh Canada." But part of it was actually very serious, and it was, "Oh Canada, we seal our eyes from true reality." And then at the end it was, "We stand unheard by thee instead of on guard for thee." And I just think that all you say, Elle, is really opening up, and it goes against that sealing our eyes from true reality. Let's open our eyes and let's not be unheard. Let's raise our voices loud enough so that we are heard, and let's get together and work together so that we are heard. So I guess we should close, but like I said, stay on a little longer if you want to be part of this, of the action. Thank you so much, Elle.
I am going to leave now. Thank you. Sorry that I'm sick, so I don't know how much I gave you, but thank you.
You gave us a lot.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.